Since 2019, women have become half the labor force in this country. That is, by labor force, we mean the people who work for a wage at an enterprise, etc., or a government office. The notion of women as in the home has long been questionable, and now it is simply a mistake for people to think like that. Women still have the majority of work assignments at home, in the household, a leftover of a culture that has not yet adjusted to the economic realities of our time. But women are now half of the paid labor force in the United States, going up or down sometimes. Women inside labor unions have noticed the fact that women in a labor union are earning roughly 30% more than women who are not in a union. That's a bigger gap than you would see if you looked at men. It's really interesting that women are now the leading force in unionization. 60% of the unions formed in the last 2 or 3 years of a rising militancy of labor organization have been women. Women are not only part of the labor force, they are more and more entitled to be called a leading part or the leading part of American unionization. And it's interesting for us to examine for a moment why that is. Okay, here's an interesting thought for you to process with me. Majority of the workers deemed essential during the pandemic were women workers. Women lost most of the jobs that were lost because of the pandemic and the crash of the capitalist economy that happened together with the pandemic. Women were disproportionately affected because they are still given the majority of childcare tasks. Women were disproportionately affected by the collapse of the inadequate childcare system the United States already had before the pandemic hit, which was made much worse by the effects of the pandemic. In short, women lost the support they got from childcare centers when those were closed. Wow. Women were forced by the pandemic and the crash and the failure of the government to step in and offset those things, a terrible failure of American capitalism. Women have become more militant. They've understood badly and painfully the failure of this society to support its working class. They are discovering through the dense fog of ideology that they need unions and that they need change. And that's why they're becoming leaders, striking, unionizing, teaching one another, their children, and all the rest of us what they've learned, which is there needs to be big challenges, either to get capitalism to change itself and perform better for the mass of people, or to give way to an alternative system that can serve the majority of people better. You can condense all that and think to yourself, it's a radicalization of women, but that is indeed what is happening. The growing inequality that I'm going to speak to in a moment as the third challenge to capitalism plays its role here too. But it plays its role in an interesting differentiation. The strains and stresses of capitalism, the relative decline in real income that we are suffering and have suffered for years now, the instability of an economy that has really crashed now twice in the last 15 years, 2008 and 9, the so-called Great Recession, and then the crash of 2020 worsened by the pandemic. It's shaken everybody. That's why the society is riven with so-called culture wars and social divisions and regional divisions and racial divisions. The feeling that so many have that the country's falling apart, yeah, but it's playing a particularly interesting gender-different role. A much larger proportion of middle-aged white men find Mr. Trump's effort to cope with this collapse more attractive compared to women who are much more likely to go not in Trump's direction, but in a progressive direction. It's quite clear. If you look at the progressive Democrats, the proportion of women among them is obvious, and that's continuing. This is a very deep fissure opening up underneath the complacent exterior of U.S. society. Women are taking a lead. And I think we're going to see more and more that they come to understand, as the French did, that capitalism is a big part of the problem, and going beyond capitalism can and should be a big part of the response and the solution that people find and pursue.